live. I'm gonna cut the AC on. It's a little bit hot in here. So, I don't have any. I don't have any film in my camera. I keep saying that I don't have any film. What I really mean is that I don't have any storage in my camera because I've been taking a bunch of pictures and doing a bunch of videos. So, so what I want to get into is the American Jew series. It's the AC. So I've done a few videos, two videos on this topic already. And of course now it's a topic of conversation for everybody. Are the real Israelites Black Americans, right? We know that to be the case, but what we don't understand is how it's that way and what it looks like and what that means for everyday life and everyday understanding. And that's what the American Jew series is really all about, is trying to explain that concept with terminology that you'd be familiar with, that you've already heard in history about the Jews that we thought were Jews before we realized that we were Jews. So that's what the American Jew series is. And what it does is it goes over the history of America starting at about the 1940s. Yeah, about the 1940s, and detailing how America has treated the Black Jews of America. So it doesn't even go over, of course, the first 350 years of this captivity. It just starts from the most recent era so that you can see that things haven't changed. I mean, even though we're not in a, what do they say, chattel slavery state, we're still in a captive state and still a captive people and still suffering from, atrocities in the same way that the Jews were suffering from atrocities in World War II. We just don't look at it that way because it's institutionalized. So the first video goes over the housing projects in America, the government housing system, and how it became the way that it is, and what it is really, and what it amounts to is that these housing projects that came up all in about the 1940s in every large city in the country with the Black population are concentration camps. That's what they are. They're concentration camps for the Black Jews. And so what we think of as Jewish ghettos in Nazi Germany, we actually have here. And not only do we have them as a regular part of the Black community. And it hasn't always been that way. This is really a new thing that, within the last 60, 80 years, yeah, but it's really a new development, a new phase of captivity for our people. And, don't get me wrong, not everybody that's Black lives in projects in the United States, but hear me out. So you have in the history of America several times when Black people as Black Hebrew people, Israelites, as a nation, have begun to become successful. So right after our ancestors were freed, the slaves were freed, around the second generation of freed slaves became wealthy, made a middle class in America. So you're looking at about 1880 to 1890. You start getting college graduates. You start getting Black doctors, Black lawyers. You start getting a booming middle class in America. This is during the time of Tulsa, right? Or maybe, am I getting my eras confused here? But in some regions of the country, you have Black banks, you have Black postal services, you have Black universities already opening up before 1900. Even in the city where I'm from, you had, a Black university, a Black college that was just right there and thriving. I think it was a nursing school. So what happened is, you know, there had to be implemented a new system of laws which kept black people from attaining status and wealth. So Jim Crow was at it, and, the Ku Klux Klan was formed. So now you have a police system, a nationwide police force, which are solely utilized for maintaining and terrorizing the black community, solely for that purpose. So that's your first real police force in America, is some of these Ku Klux Klan gangs who later on become the police force, right? We know this, right? So that's how the first wave of sabotage happened, right? And this is straight from the government. This is not really, and here's another point that I want to drive home too. It looks pretty bad when you say that America is a Nazi country, or a country that is imprisoning Jews, and use the same terminology that you would use for Nazi Germany, because there's a lot of people in America, and a lot of people that don't consider themselves Nazis, right? And of course, they're not. The average white person doesn't know anything about any of this and is living their daily lives, and they see all of these things and connect it to racism or, poverty or impoverished state. They don't connect it to a government operation, because really that's what it is. You find out that the reason why we live in projects all over the country is because of government operations, of what the U.S. government has done to the people. So that's why it's considered a Holocaust, because it's a government organ, and that's why it's considered a Nazi country, even though the people in it don't know they're Nazis, because these operations are ongoing. And it's the government that's doing it, and the people that kind of walk around oblivious to it. So, and then you do have people that are not oblivious to it, that protest and march right along with us, but they don't really realize the extent of the terrorizing and the oppression. And, for the most part, we don't either. We don't realize the extent of it. So anyways, you go back to the invention of the project system in the 1940s, and what you have there is a nationwide overhaul of the of the inner city in the 1940s. So let me back up just a little bit. You're in now the 1920s, after you come out of slavery, and then you were successful, and then Jim Crow, and then now you're kind of overcoming that. You're moving to the bigger cities. You're spreading out further, deeper, more west, to escape some of this turmoil in the South, right? So there's an exodus period during that time frame, when people start going to Chicago, people start going to Detroit, people start going west to LA, to all of these different places from the deep South, right? To escape some of this Jim Crowism, right? So this exodus occurs, and in these small places where black people go, they start to create thriving economies again. So you look at, in the 1920s, that you have a craze, a dance craze, that goes all throughout the country with a set of dances, the Charleston, all of these different dances and dance styles that come out in the 1920s, and all come from the black community. And all of these, different song and dance routines that have its own soul and come from the black community, and start to make the black community rich again, right? And so I'm just breaking down the timeline of the American Jew series, really before you get to it, reaching up to the 1940s, just if you're following along. So during this time period, you have what they call the Roaring 20s, right? But the reason why the 20s were roaring, especially in New York and some of these other places, is because you had the Harlem Renaissance going on. All this black music, all this black culture, all of this economics that's going on in the black community, and it created a boom for the whole country. And that's what the Roaring Twenties was. It was, a embracing of black culture. They had to stop it. And that's what the Great Depression was about. Because we know, us that have been in the conspiracy community for a little while, if you've done any research on American history too, that the Depression was caused by the stock market crash in 1928. And if you look deeply into the stock market crash, you could look and see that it could have been avoided. And if it could have been avoided, it also could have been caused. So when you look at it in that light and you start investigating it from that aspect, it appears as if it was orchestrated, that the actual crash itself was orchestrated. And right on time, because it halted, absolutely halted black progress in New York and Detroit and all of these other different places where these thrive, in Chicago, where these thriving blues communities and dance communities and, economic situations that were, kind of cordoned off from everywhere else, but still very popular, cut that short. Now everybody's back into a poor state, like a great reset, right? So that happened in 1928, and it, wiped out a lot of wealth. Of course, the right people got out at the right time, but it wiped out a lot of wealth in America, and they had to then, because they're, of course, planning on multiple fronts, they had to get their wealth back up by going and joining into a war, orchestrating and provoking Japan to get them into the war. Because you have to put all of these pieces together. We know that Pearl Harbor could have been prevented, but America kind of made some moves to, kind of pull Japan out of it, of its territory and make it, active. So we know that happened. So we orchestrated our way into World War II and started production in World War II. But look what we didn't do as a country in America. And I say we, really them. But what they didn't do was draft a bunch of black men, train them to go into war, and send them into World War II. Most of them stayed behind. My grandfather went. He was a cook. He wasn't an infantry soldier. He was a cook. That's why you don't see a whole lot of movies with all black units in World War II. You see what I mean? They weren't apt to send Hebrews, the most powerful warriors in the world, if they're, keeping the commandment. They weren't apt in training them because they knew that they could come back and conquer the country if they start keeping the commandments. So in the first, big wars, after slavery, they wasn't trying to send nobody black. So World War I, no black units, or very few. World War II, very few black units, very few black men, people in it at all. That began to change, and I can, go over why that was and why they started to change their mind about doing that, really because of what happened in World War II, what we're about to get into. So all the white men, or a lot of them, during the 40s, 30s and 40s, were gone away in the war, the 40s for the war. And so who they left behind, black men and white women, began to create a thriving work economy. So we all have heard of, if you look at American history, you see the picture of the woman with the bandana and she's got the arm doing like this, and it's supposed to represent how women stepped up in the, in the assembly industry, while the men of the greatest generation, they call it World War II generation, were gone off to war, right? But what they don't tell you is that black men were left behind too, and they stepped up too. They started to get these jobs that white men had previously held, these big time, industry jobs. And not only that, there was a lot more of them because of the war effort. So you had, for, a period of time in the 1940s, that black people became rich again. People don't know this. Before the projects and before they destroyed our community again, we had a middle class again in the 1940s. And people started to buy houses in the suburbs. And that's why you have a lot of these cities that were outside of the city, because black people started having money and started spending money on themselves and their community. And they had to stop that again. So what happened was they had to implement a housing structure in such a way that that would cripple the black community economically, and then have an avenue to poison them otherwise too, for chemical warfare and psychological warfare as well. So what they did was they came up with this plan after World War II was over, after they had all this money, to implement a new deal, right? Some of these projects had already been created, like I believe there was some in New York already, there were some in other parts of the country. But what they did was, when they first started building these projects all over the country, in every single city, at the same time, they started building suburbs with houses with no buyers, houses made off of government contracts with no buyers, government-made, designed suburbs. So you've got two things happening at once: the building of the projects in the inner cities and the building of the suburbs outside the city, happening at the same time. So as the white men started coming back into society from war, and find now that they have these, black counterparts that are doing their jobs and doing their jobs well, there started to be, in the workplace, some tension. So these projects were well suited for these incoming soldiers that may be, a little bit shell-shocked, distraught, and then the next generation too, to get into these projects, and then develop themselves back into a middle class from what they were before. And so if you'll look, the projects, they say, were made for returning veterans and white people, poor white people. And so if you can see that they used the project system in its first generation to help out the white population. And this is all documented. In fact, the video goes in, this is where the video starts in the first video, when it discusses the project system. So at this point in time, white people have come back, they're in the projects, and the suburbs are being built. And there's actually legislation in the United States government that grants cheap houses to the people coming out of the projects after they've paid this cheap rent. This generation of white people come out of the projects and move directly into the suburbs. All of this is documented. All of it's a government plan. So as the projects start to become empty, black people, seeing that, white people have, created lives for themselves using the project system, start to move in mass. And then places that were once all white projects then began to fill up with black folks. And that was the trap. That was the plan to get us to want to be there, to see the success of other people, and then get comfortable there. And so here's the other part of the plan. The suburbs, at that point in time, were exclusively white. The ones that were government contracted, built suburbs, in the government contract, and this is all in the video, documented, historical fact, in the contracts that the government created, the American government created, it was illegal to sell the property to a black family. Not only was it illegal to sell the property to a black family for one generation, it was also illegal for the next person to sell, to own the house, to sell to somebody black either. So it was two guaranteed generations that would not live in the suburbs. So automatically there, you have a wealth gap. Now the children that have this mortgage, this house, have a $50,000 to $60,000 wealth value over the people in the projects now, or let's just say in the 50s in that next generation, the 60s in that next generation, more than the black people that are in those projects at that time. Because they couldn't get out. They couldn't go to the suburbs. They couldn't get a way out. And then they were also very comfortable. Then the deterioration starts. The money stops flowing. And here's another thing that happened in that generation. Here's another thing that happened in that generation. The industry started moving out of the cities. And you'll see all this in the video. The industry purposefully was seduced into the suburbs by tax breaks and all of these other incentives to get out of the city and move their industry to the suburbs. And we see what was left behind was like what they described, in some of the clips that I've got for the video as an economic boom, an economic bomb. So now you have, in the 1950s and 60s, unemployment in the inner city. You have now drugs coming in from these wars. Now that you've got them in the projects, you can send them to war then, because you're not just fighting a war in Germany now. Now you're fighting this war in Korea and in Vietnam, places that are historically known for being able to have the big drug facilities. And now you're getting a people hooked on drugs in Vietnam, carrying drugs back and forth from Vietnam to America on American planes. Now, I didn't put that in the video, but they made a whole movie about that. Denzel Washington is in it. I can't remember the name of it. American Gangster. They made a whole movie about that, how they were shipping drugs to the black community directly from the war. And you think that they don't know that that's going on? It wasn't Denzel Washington's plan, or whoever the dude actually was. I know it's not Denzel, but whoever the guy was that did it, it's based on a true story. It wasn't his plan. He was an agent, right? He was an agent. He was working for the government. So here we are now with a community full of people that are hooked on drugs, from coming in from Vietnam, from having these war wounds. You have no industry, no jobs. And then you have the project system, which now is implementing that you can't have a man in there if you expect to stay in the projects. So now you're breaking the families apart. This is all a strategized war, done by the United States government. All of these are policies. Policies. So that's why it's a Holocaust. That's why it's a, genocide. And so that's not even the worst part. So the worst part is that now you're getting into the 60s and 70s and getting into the drug era, and now you have the 80s come up, and now you have crack cocaine, which was invented and distributed into the projects, and from the projects into the rest of the community by the CIA. So it's an intentional poisoning of the black community at its lowest point. An intentional poisoning. Because how many people know a drug addict? How many people have an uncle, a grandfather, a cousin, a sister, a brother? It's a drug addict, a crack addict, a heroin addict. And intentional poisoning, yeah, that got some of, white people too. But remember, this is not the regular, average, everyday white person. The average, everyday white person don't know all this. It's the United States government. It's the people in power. They're so willing to kill black people that they're willing to get anybody that's around them too, which sometimes end up being their own children. So this is what I mean. This is what I mean by a Holocaust, an intentional poisoning. Now think about what happened in this generation, the 80s, the destruction that crack cocaine caused the community, not just from being a user, but also a distributor. And look at the gang culture. Look at the kingpin culture that's created from that. A trap, a real deal trap that destroyed an entire 2 to 3 generations of black men. Destroyed. Because how many are in prison? How many are dead? How many are dope heads? And how many families are destroyed from that? So this is the reason why America is not the place to be. Because that was a well thought out, well executed plan. And guess what? The people that executed it are still in power. It's the same families that are still in power now. The Bushes and the Clintons are the people that orchestrated these plans. The Bushes came up with the idea for where to get the drugs from. Nicaragua, Central America, South America. They provided the planes to fly the drugs in. They brought them and distributed them all over the country, in the dead center of the country, Mena, Arkansas. The governor of Arkansas at the time oversaw the entire situation. Who was the governor of Arkansas in the 80s? Bill Clinton. Joe Biden wrote the 3 strikes law, that if you get caught such and such amount of times with drugs, you're going away for 25 to life. It was a well thought out, well organized, well executed Holocaust. And the people that executed it are still in power. That's what the American Jew series is about. It's an explanation of your current situation as an Israelite. If they made such a good plan and executed it and destroyed so many people already and haven't been caught for it, because this information is public information. Everybody knows the CIA smuggled drugs into the country. Everybody knows the CIA distributed drugs to kingpins in black communities. Everybody knows that black folks can't bring drugs into the community, can't bring guns into the community from other places. Everybody knows that already. What they don't know is that it was so successful that they never saw it coming. And they also don't know what they're doing now. Because like I said, those same people are still in power. What makes you think that they're not still doing plans against us? Because look at our community now. It's more dangerous than it's ever been. And getting worse and worse. So that's the American Jew series. Trying to, as cinematically as possible, show you what's really going on and why it makes sense not to stay. Shalom, shalom, y'all.